I would just like to say that every CRT conversation, there's
Mhm.
always a battle over definitions, and
Yes.
Yep.
there's no way to avoid it ever.
You
Right.
tried like a champ at the Better
Well,
Discourse.
I was
Sean,
trying. Yeah, I don't know.
Well,
I mean, it's pretty frustrating because I wanted to ask at one point, do you think that when people say white supremacists that they're factually miscommunicating with most people, right?
Mhm.
It's like if you respond to that with yes, then I think you can like almost fully build the bridge between you guys, because that's just acknowledging, okay, some of these terms, at the very least, they are putting inaccurate things in people's minds, right?
Yes.
It doesn't really matter whether it's intentional or not. It's just there was already an established definition of these words or phrases or whatever, and you introduce a new one that is very different, and people will confuse them, right?
Yeah.
And like that to me defines almost the entire conversation.
Yes.
It happens with racism and white supremacy and whiteness, and I mean almost nearly every word except for intersectionality, which isn't appropriating something else. It's its own phrase.
mhm.
Like that miscommunication, that's sort of, you could call it equivocation or misunderstanding or whatever. That's like the whole that's every conversation about this shit. It's so obnoxious.
Yeah.
Like
What you were saying was so good, Doomer, when you were talking to Jangles about that, where you were isolating that point, because it is very prescient.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like, I don't think, like, despite the level of hostility of some of the conversation, I don't think you guys disagree about that much. Like, if you were to talk about like policy prescriptions or descriptions of reality or underlying, principles, I really don't think you disagree about that much. Like, a lot of the conversation is just arguing about the definitions of words.
Right. But no, you're completely right. And I think you are right that we probably agree on a lot. But that's the problem, is that I'm over here saying this thing that you're advocating for, that other people are advocating for, want to destroy the thing you say you want.
I know. Yeah.
It's going to bring about this people being more racist. It's going to bring about all these negative changes. And I guess the problem is that Jangles just doesn't see, like he would say that I'm having too much of a, I'm looking for the negative interpretation too much, when I think is looking too much for the positive interpretation.
Mhm.
Because to me, it's very obvious why they use the term whiteness, why they use the term white supremacy, why they use the term systemic racism, that these are, as you said, these are all intentionally incendiary on purpose.
Yeah.
And
By design.
I would actually
Someone-
disagree with the idea that you guys don't disagree that much, because if you don't agree on that fundamental premise that the disparities are due to past discrimination or ongoing discrimination, then there's no way you can agree on what the remedy of that is in terms of policy. Like if you're in the camp that I'm in, where I don't think that's the case, largely that it's a behavioral issue.
I think
which
it's
determines your
closer
success.
to past discrimination, Sean. So I might disagree with you on that.
I
I
mean,
mean, it's
but if
yeah,
you treat all disparities, wealth, income, and all that, and if you think that the majority of those
Sean.
disparities are due to discrimination, then maybe you will agree on some of
Sean,
them crazy
Sean,
policies.
hold on one second here, Sean. It could be both though, because in the Woke Racism, the new book by John McWhorter, he talks about how past discrimination creates a cultural pattern that people continue kind of without thought. So
he
it could be
theorizes that.
So
that
you've read it too, okay.
That discrimination in schools, for example, this is one of the ones that he gave, led teachers to greatly underestimate and dismiss the intellectual capacity of Black students. Therefore, culturally, Black people, but this is a theory, reject school because they think school rejects them.
right.
Like that's
Right.
an interesting.
But you're
theory.
you're saying the culture you're saying behaviorally the cultural has to change, but the culture was established by the racist intent of the past.
I don't know how much of that is true and how much of it isn't true, because we saw, like, if you read I forget which one of Thomas Sowell's books about the Northern Blacks and how
I know.
fared in education, it was completely different.
Black rednecks and white liberals.
Yeah, so like they would have faced probably worse discrimination, because this is at a time when they weren't allowed to vote. They were perceived, even though they weren't slaves, they were still considered like the exemption from the normal Blacks in society, and yet they out succeeded, what we saw from black people who were freed generations later.
I think we're saying the same thing though. You're saying that the culture has to change, the behavior has to change, but you don't believe that behavior was created and is continuing today via past racism.
Well,
Right.
let me.
And you could just look at other, I think a portion of it, sure, but like it's not like these problems don't exist in other places around the world. Like in Japan, there's such a deference to tradition and to your elders that they still use fax machines in offices, which
my
is
God.
like it's
terrible.
outdated.
Yeah, I
It
know,
makes
right.
no sense. It's like they're building sex robots, but they're also sending schematics over fax.
Oh,
Like that
that's
doesn't
ridiculous.
make sense.
Right.
Yeah.
But so let me ask a hypothetical. So if, say, when America was founded, America just didn't have slaves at all, and that instead, black people just immigrated to the U.S. the same way white people did, in the 1800s, and there was this is a magical world where there was no racism and there was no segregation or any of this stuff. Do you think that there would still be this wealth disparity between blacks and whites on average? Do you still think there'd be these cultural differences?
Well, we see a wealth disparity between Africans and Europeans. So like it would follow, it's actually much narrower in the United States, but it might not be the same at all because again, immigrants have the selection bias. So
I'm talking about like immigrants from immigrating here from the 1600s, right?
Yeah, but they would still have the selection bias. It's a dangerous journey and all that.
Sure,
like,
right.
it would be like I can't say that it would be equivalent. Like they could be an outperforming minority, like the minority that outperforms the majority. Like Nigerians are technically better than the average American.
Well, no, but what I'm trying to get at is like, I'm trying to isolate the specific variable here because I'm saying like if you could wave a magic wand and you reconstruct reality so that all the slaves in the 1700s were actually immigrants and there was no racism, I don't think American society, in terms of wealth disparity and all the other racial problems we have, I don't think America would look the way it does today. That's why I do think
there would be differences for sure.
Why I think there'd be huge differences.
But it also depends on where they would end up, how much of their African traditions, because there are also destructive African traditions that prevent success, were brought over and unchallenged. If they ended up in the South, then they might have absorbed some of the dominant culture from the South, which we all agree was a negative culture.
Sure. But I think
even absent the racism,
I think this does kind of play back, because you've brought up the statistic about how, a lot of economic indicators for Black communities have done worse after a lot of the civil rights legislation passed, not better. And I do think part of this is when I'm reading the CRT literature, assuming that they're correct, they say that the majority of the Black community was more in favor at the time, or the popular narrative was the Black separatist, Black nationalist narrative. And I wonder if that idea, that toxic idea, is what's created a lot of the problems we're still seeing today. It's just this, turn away from success because we're going to characterize success as being white.
Oh, I think that's definitely a detriment for sure. Like if there are successful behaviors like studying in school and on all these things that you reject culturally, you can't be surprised when you see negative outcomes. I don't know like what percentage of I don't know, like it would depend on a lot of different like things, because again, we got a bunch of like, terrible people from the borderlands of Scotland and England that came to the American South, and the American South was just not productive. So it would depend in part like what African immigrants would be able to come here. And by the way, a lot of them, if they didn't come as slaves, wouldn't be welcome here throughout the early history of America.
It's just a hypothetical situation. Yes.
But it depends. Like I don't see, like it would probably be different. I would hope it would be better. Like they could be, like I said, they could easily be a minority group that outperforms the majority group, especially if they were like an oppressed minority group, because most minority groups aren't actually oppressed and then do worse. They're oppressed because they're already doing better. Right. Like that's what a lot of anti-Semitism, the Armenian genocide, like all these other different like attacks on minorities are about, them outperforming. So it would depend on which Africans came, obviously, and like what they brought with them.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I think we just disagree. Me and Adam do think that the history of racism, like a lot of the negative attributes of culture that we're talking about, and CRT turning away from, quote, white culture as being successful, is a direct response to racism. It's kind of like a defense mechanism.
I mean,
emotionally.
So sure, but also like maybe the perception of racism instead of actual racism.
Yeah,
No,
I
I
would agree
agree.
with
Yeah,
that
100%.
completely,
Yes,
Right.
definitely.
So like one of the interesting things
That's
I
why I'm
found is
so against CRT is because it makes the perception of racism that much worse.
Right.
right. Well, one of the things, and I'm sure you guys have read about this too, that I found is the idea of last names, like getting rid of your quote unquote slave name, and how that became a big movement in the 60s because they're like, oh, these people took the name of their slave master, and that's
Right.
horrible. And in reality, the reason slaves created family names, sure, they noticed that the whites had family names, is if they were separated, they would want to be able to find each other like later on because they wanted to reunite with their family. So oftentimes they didn't just have the name of the plantation owner because that wouldn't make it easier to find your family. So they had secret family names. And at the end of the Civil War, there's like accounts of freed slaves like walking across entire states to be reunited with their family. So like it's the thing that bothers me is when people say that the like legacy of broken homes is due to racism or slavery, when from the end of slavery up until the 1960s, the black home was together. Like they had a strong emphasis on family, so it didn't really make a lot of sense to attribute it's related to slavery, but also it kicked in 100 years after slavery ended.
Sure.
That never made any sense to me.
Well, it seemed like before then there was the attitude of we need to reject success seems to be a lot of the key factor here about problems with toxic cultures. And it didn't seem like that attitude, I could be wrong, but it seemed like that attitude really came about with the Black separatist movement in the 60s.
Yeah, for sure. And like they're it's funny because they like the separatist position was represented in the ending slavery side. That's what Liberia is all about. Is
Right.
you send them to their own country. And by the way, when black people went to Liberia from the Americas, they completely set up like a class system where the American blacks were on the top of the Africans, which immediately did the same thing.
Didn't Liberia descend into chaos though? Liberia was like a completely failed state.
It's not gone particularly well.
Yeah.